autopsy data. So the evidence is very substantial. One of the things that many people know me for is my campaigning on highlighting the harms of excess sugar going back 10 years or so. I was the lead campaigner in this country, and I went to 10 Downing Street twice for my work on obesity. I met Jeremy Hunt when he's Secretary for Health and influenced the introduction of a sugary drinks tax. And I did this through initial analyses in medical journals, in the BMJ, for example, around the harms of sugar. I can tell you categorically, Laurence, the harms of the mRNA vaccine when it comes to cardiovascular effects, in terms of the quality of the data, is far superior than the evidence we have on sugar in terms of its harms to the heart. That's what we're dealing with here. So the question is now, what is the prevalence of that, and how does that relate to the benefits of the vaccine? And we've analyzed that as well. And, you know, when we look at the cardiovascular effects in particular, certainly the original trials suggested that serious adverse events, and the most common of those serious adverse events are issues relating to clotting, so heart attacks, strokes, lung clots, for example, were higher or more likely to get a serious adverse event than one was to be hospitalized with COVID. What was most extraordinary, though, when I was doing my own investigation analyses, was discovering the fact that the World Health Organization, Laurence, had endorsed a list when the vaccines were being rolled out of potential serious adverse events to look out for. And we look at that list, it's extraordinary. And essentially anything and everything that can go wrong with the heart is on that list, from heart attacks, pericarditis, arrhythmias, atrial fibrillation, heart failure. It's all there, and that's what we are seeing in the community. Certainly those are the patients, some of those patients I've managed myself.
I noticed
it needs to be
as
altered,
well.
And I think, yeah.
I noticed psychosis on there as well, which I think some of our jab fanatics quite enjoy. They're shouting at me in my ear again. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's unfortunate. It's interesting you say that, because what happens with the spike protein from the vaccine, it seems to be distributed in every organ system in the body. And for some people, unfortunately, it can cause either a direct toxicity or an autoimmune reaction. And that includes the brain, the heart, the liver, the kidneys, the ovaries, the testes. And I think that's probably why the WHO put that list out. And they put that list out based upon 4 bits of information. You know, side effects, serious side effects from other vaccines, you know, which may have been very rare, but still possible. Animal studies, the technology that was being used, and COVID itself. Certainly COVID in severe cases, people who were hospitalized in intensive care seem to cause problems in multiple organs. It's certainly not the case for mild COVID. In fact, you know, interestingly, a few weeks ago, the Times newspaper headlined with even mild COVID linked to heart disease and strokes. And I looked at the research on which that headline was based, and it was the complete opposite, actually. Their research found the opposite. Mild COVID was linked to less risk of a heart attack. And there was certainly no increased risk of mild COVID of things like myocarditis, for example. So there's a lot of misinformation out there, and a lot of it, unfortunately, in my view, Laurence, is being fueled by very powerful vested interests. You've got to remember the pharmaceutical industry have got a lot of power and influence, both visible and invisible, unchecked power over many, many years. They exert their power over academic institutions, over the regulator. I mean, our regulator in the UK, the MHRA, gets 86% of its funding from Pharma. Independent scientists in the BMJ, Donald Light, sociologist, he actually said the regulators, you know, they're not independent, they're not rigorous, they withhold their data, they're selective, and as long as they're captured by industry funding, the public must know that they cannot be trusted. And this is a real crisis, something that we've never experienced before on this scale, and I think it will ultimately go down as a big scandal. And the scandal isn't so much that mistakes were made. You know, I think we made a mistake at the beginning. I think the scandal is that when the information started to evolve and come out showing that there were serious harms, that the medical authorities turned a blind eye and buried their head in the sand. You know, in medicine, you know, science evolves, you know, doctors can make errors, information changes, but patients and the public want their doctors to be honest. And I have conversations with patients all the time, say, listen, we thought this was true at the time, things have changed.
Can I ask you something just quickly? Everything you're saying makes sense to me, because I think critically. Why are there so many people who think the opposite? Why are there so many?
So great question, Laurence. So I think one of the things, we've talked about this before, I think you've mentioned it, is fear clouds one's ability to engage in critical thinking. And many of us, many people still, most of us, I would say, at the very beginning, were under a lot of fear. I mean, I think many people are still suffering from a form of PTSD from when we went to lockdowns and when we were seeing all these things on the media, images from China, from Italy, people very, very sick. We didn't know what we were dealing with. I was even one of those persons. I remember getting groceries from the supermarket and using Dettol spray to clean the packaging around the soup before I opened the vegetables, for example, because we didn't know, how contagious this was and how serious it was. So a lot of fear clouded critical thinking, and that's still a problem. And then the other issue is something called willful blindness, where organizations, in this case, institutions, are turning a blind eye to the truth in order to feel safe, avoid conflict, reduce anxiety, and protect prestige and their reputations. And in fact, that's something that Andrew Bridgen also mentioned in his speech. So I think we need to understand what we're dealing with when it comes to having conversations with people who are literally have not just ignorant, but have the illusion of knowledge.
Essentially, they become fact hesitant. What role would you say the British Heart Foundation have to play in this? And are they fit for purpose as an organisation?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I've worked with the British Heart Foundation in the past. They've got a lot of very good people there. I helped them in the campaign around getting access to defibrillators, something I wrote about many years ago, that we need more public defibrillators to reduce the, people dying from cardiac arrest. So I know there are many good people there. I think the problem with the British Heart Foundation, certainly in relation to the COVID vaccine data, they have come out with public statements which essentially say there was no link between cardiac arrest and the vaccine, there was no link with heart attacks. And at best, Laurence, those statements are outdated and misleading. And at worst, they're blatantly false. So they are not rigorously analyzing this data, absolutely not. And I think one of the reasons is that many of the experts that work with the British Heart Foundation are heavily conflicted and financially conflicted in relation to the pharmaceutical industry. One professor I won't name, who's got a very senior role at the British Heart Foundation, his institution, for example, has received hundreds of millions of pounds of research money from Big Pharma. So the problem is that people who are advising the British Heart Foundation on many of these different issues, unfortunately, are heavily conflicted. And this is what we're dealing with, really, is this scandal, if you like, around the fact that the mRNA vaccines haven't been halted so far and are going to continue to cause harm, is really a symptom of a wider problem, a wider system failure, where you have an entity such as Big Pharma that have a legal obligation to produce profit for their shareholders, not to give you the best treatment, having too much influence and power over governments, over medical guidelines, over academic institutions. And that entity, unfortunately, Laurence, has been described by a preeminent expert in this field, Dr. Robert Hare, forensic psychologist, is often behaving in a psychopathic way in order to make money. So deceiving others, conning for profit, callous disregard for the safety of others. So if one understands what's at the root of the problem, we can then explain what's happening downstream, including the willful blindness and including the misleading statements that are based upon not very good evidence. The totality evidence is very clear. This needs to be stopped, and the public need to know that they shouldn't be having any more COVID mRNA vaccines. Doctors, I think, want to do the right thing, but they themselves don't understand the system failures. I believe 99.9% of doctors go into the profession to help their patients and do the best thing for their patients. And I speak to these doctors all the time, Laurence, and one of the things I must tell you, I'm constantly now getting contacted from very eminent physicians from around the country, even cardiologists, who understand there's a major issue, are supporting what I'm doing, but themselves are afraid to speak out.
Could it be that we are completely mad, and the British Heart Foundation have released their statement? As you said, it makes no reference at all to any vaccine injuries or harms, and they're stuck to it, and we are just completely bonkers. I mean, is there a chance of that? Because it just doesn't seem to me there is, but I want to know, is there a chance, statistically?
Listen, no one's ever asked me that question before, Laurence. I think, in medicine, well, to answer the question, medicine is not an exact science. It never has been. It's an applied science. It's about using the art of probabilities. It's a science of human beings. And I think all the evidence, when you look at it in its totality, are pointing in the direction clearly that there is almost certainly very direct evidence of causality in terms of harm from these vaccines. Of course, there's always going to be an element of doubt, but the chances are very, very small.
Thank you so much, Dr. Asim Malhotra, for informing the world where others and other channels will not allow it. That